So where do we go from here? I think it's going to be a pretty flat year if we're talking about GDP. Real GDP, I think this year is going to be close to flat. The Fed laid its cards on the table. It told us in its last set of projections, it's expecting real GDP to be plus 1.4% this year. Historically, half the time when you have 1.4% growth in a given year.
Is the U.S. economy in trouble? Many experts have predicted a recession in 2024, including the Bay Street veteran and economist David Rosenberg. According to him, the United States has an 85% chance of a recession in 2024. In this video, you will find out if the U.S. economy will have a recession in 2024. Let me start with David Rosenberg. David Rosenberg on the pending recession in the U.S. and the yield curve. Rosenberg claims that since the Great Financial Crisis in 2008, this reading is the highest the model has produced. He talks more about the recession in this clip.
So I think that we're going to have a recession in 2024. I know it sounds like it's a stale argument, but to tell people that there's no recession because it hasn't happened yet, which I heard plenty of in 2007 when I was working for Mother Merrill, is like telling somebody in Toronto, Canada that because it didn't snow in December, winter's been called off.
The model includes international term spreads, the yield curve's level, financial conditions indices, and the debt service ratio. It is based on a working National Bureau of Economic Research report. Because it has a track record of accurately predicting recessions without sending out misleading signals since 1999, Rosenberg said that this economic model had superiority over other models. He said that by the beginning of 2023, the yield curve indicator indicated a 50% likelihood of a recession. Still, this model only predicted a 12% chance. In this interview video, Scott Mingert of Guggenheim Partners describes how the yield curve indicator's form is one of the most useful indicators of the ahead economic picture. Let's hear what he has to say in this clip.
As the Fed raised rates is telling us that that's probably leading us into a recession. If you look at where the shape of the yield curve is today, historically we would expect a recession probably in about 1 to 1.5 years as things evolve.
And is that when you expect us to have a recession?
I think so. It all depends on what happens now. If the Fed is forced to reduce rates because of some other exogenous event that's out there, then history shows us that that allows the expansion to continue, but it also allows the excesses to build up.
Rosenberg, however, is adamant that the relatively recent economic model has shown itself to be more accurate than the yield curve measure. Our conviction that the recession has been delayed but not derailed is still running at a high level, Rosenberg stated in support of his argument. In 2023, the full model predicted the soft landing seen in the year, and now the recession probabilities for 2024, according to the model, are highly elevated. The model doubts the increasing notion that the economy will likely pull off a soft landing or no landing scenario this year. Rosenberg points out the stock market would suffer greatly if a recession happens. Although recessions are a normal business cycle component and usually follow a Fed rate hiking cycle that extends past the yield curve inversion point, Rosenberg said that few asset classes are priced for that result. Rosenberg explained why the yield curve was not a reliable indicator of the impending recession in 2017 to 2019. The signal from the inverted U.S. yield curve was outweighed by the easy credit conditions, very low debt service requirements, and favorable international term spreads. Leaving Rosenberg, his model, and the yield curve indicator aside, let's examine the U.S. economy during the past several years by segmenting it into 4 main phases. This will help provide a clearer picture than the economic data suggests. 1. The boom before COVID. For much of the past half-century, the U.S. economy has underperformed. For most families, growth in wealth and income has been sluggish and inequality has increased. The most obvious indication of the issues is that life expectancy in the United States is currently lower than in any other high-income nation, and the difference is insignificant. Nevertheless, there have been a few short instances of economic growth. One started around the end of Barack Obama's presidency and persisted under Donald Trump. Following the housing catastrophe, the nation gradually recovered as businesses grew and consumer spending increased. In 2016 and 2018, the unemployment rate dropped below 5% and below 4%, respectively. Take a look at this graph for more details. All income categories gained due to the competitive job market and some states' minimum wage hikes. The U.S. economy was doing as well in the short run by early 2020 as it had since the dot-com boom 2 decades prior. 2. The COVID breakdown. Then came the pandemic like an August visitor. People reduced their spending and stayed at home. Employers let go of employees and the unemployment rate rose beyond 10%. It made sense that experts were concerned that the economy might enter a vicious cycle where businesses failed, households could not pay their debts, and banks failed. Following the housing crash in the early 2000s, several economists felt that the federal government had been overly cautious in providing stimulus. Members of Congress pledged during the epidemic not to make the same mistake twice. This video shows they passed significant stimulus legislation, which President Biden approved.
Last night, this was close. Speaking of votes on the House floor, this one was close, just a couple of votes over the hurdle that they needed. The House did pass, ultimately, this measure now to increase the stimulus payments to individuals from $600, which was in the bill that passed last week and that the president ultimately signed, to $2,000.
Free. The too hot comeback. The stimulus plans were somewhat successful. Despite all the suffering it brought about, the COVID-19 pandemic proved less detrimental to the economy than the housing crisis. The increase in unemployment was brief. Furthermore, the average American family's financial status improved during the pandemic because of the stimulus, which was not the case in the wake of the housing crisis. Washington, in other words, overlearned the lesson from the past crisis. During the epidemic, so much money was poured into the economy that households could indulge in extravagant spending. In reaction, companies increased their pricing. The pandemic's effects on the supply chain were also rather significant. Price hikes resulted from this combination of low supply and high demand. 4. The healthy revival. When inflation increases, it can stay high for a long time, like it did in the late 1960s and early 1980s. Businesses increased prices even further in response to worker demands for larger salaries and rising costs. There is a reinforcing dynamic. David Rosenberg recollects the 2007 recession call in this clip.
Reminds me of the summer of '07. Rates backed up sharply. Everybody was saying, where's this recession? Recession started in December of '07. I was sitting here probably with you in June and July of '07, and you were talking about how the hell did the 10-year note ratchet up to 5.35? And then the next, a year later, we're down to 100 basis points.
So when inflation surged in 2021, a few experts believed the pattern was returning. They said things wouldn't return to normal until a severe recession. However, these ominous forecasts proved incorrect. Rather, in 2022, inflation began to decline quickly. The majority of supply chain issues were resolved together with the conclusion of the stimulus plans, which was sufficient to stop price hikes. According to Forbes, the economy has shown signs of being healthy over the past several months, with earnings and employment increasing moderately. Annual inflation decreased from 3.4% in December to 3.1% in January. Simply put, experts had anticipated a greater collapse than there was. Why did it happen? Perhaps the figure from last month was only a statistical anomaly. However, it could indicate that the economy has grown too robust for inflation to continue declining. The state of the economy is better now than it was even a year ago by practically all measures, but it hasn't recovered from the epidemic yet. Despite the healthy recovery, many are still on the verge of going wrong. The Federal Reserve's tightening had harmed the country. 4 delay factors to the negative effects of the Federal Reserve's tightening. Back to the video, a longer time lag for the negative effects of the Federal Reserve's tightening is explained by 4 different factors. First, as loan rates rise, sales of cars and light trucks often decline, which causes manufacturing to be reduced. This time, despite the nation's pent-up demand for new vehicles due to previous supply chain issues, cars became more accessible, and their costs slightly decreased in 2023. However, since the pent-up demand has essentially been met, there's a high chance that sales will decline in 2024. A mismatch in the supply and demand of electric vehicles will highlight it. Business capital spending, which typically decreases as the Fed tightens, is the source of the second delay. The reduction is partly caused by the larger capital cast and partly by the monetary tightening and lower expectations for future demand. But this cycle has made businesses order machinery, computers, and other supplies to make up for the employees they were having problems hiring. The tight labor market is a factor in the third delay as well. Some laid-off workers immediately found new jobs after months of driving past help wanted posters. While this was not the case for every individual who had been laid off, it was considerable to delay consumer spending reductions. The fourth delay originated from those who were laid off or concerned about being laid off. Most people had kept their pandemic stimulus checks, letting them accumulate for a year before progressively depleting their bank accounts. Compared to a normal business cycle, they haven't had to make as many cuts to their discretionary spending. By the middle of 2024, households will have depleted their pandemic reserves. However, they will still retain the regular savings accrued over the previous several years. The capital investment component may help to mitigate the inevitable slump. Still, the majority of these four factors are only delays. According to textbook theory, the ideal economic strategy increases stimulus when the nation weakens. Specifically, consumer savings are being spent when the economy would not be strong otherwise. Similar patterns are observed among corporate capital investment and vehicle sales. Since these events are happening at precisely the right moment, the peak was somewhat reduced and the valley that followed filled up. More source of risk to the U.S. economy. The U.S. has witnessed a dramatic increase in interest rates over the previous 2 years, which should still cause an economic slowdown, even with the drop in the money supply. While still favorable, growth will be less than the long-term average. Unemployment will likely increase somewhat, but not significantly. According to David Rosenberg, inflation will keep falling until it approaches the Federal Reserve's 2% target. Here's a clip of Rosenberg discussing it.
It's like for economists, it's like a race between watching grass grow and paint dry. It's a process. But I do think that once we start to see the break in the rental data, and you're seeing in real time, rents are coming down month after month. It's not been fully reflected because of these 3-year distributive lags in the CPI. When the rental deflation shows through, and this may well be more of a story in the second half of the year into 2024, considering that its rents are 30% of the index, I think you're going to be very surprised, Sarah, that inflation is going to come down a lot more than what the consensus believes right now.
The Federal Reserve has ceased considering more rate hikes. Still, they are unlikely to believe they must lower interest rates strongly. Short-term interest rates will likely be lowered to a neutral level by the middle of 2024. Their argument will be that, although they shouldn't stick to their previous tight money practices, they also don't need to implement an easy money policy. Geopolitical issues are the primary source of risk to the economy. Iran's attempts to undercut U.S. allies, particularly Ukraine, are demonstrated by its military actions in Israel. China's influence on Taiwan also prompts concerns. If Venezuela invades Guyana's oil resources, the United States could be compelled to defend that nation, making us susceptible to additional difficulties. Although the crisis is likely far off, both parties' extravagant U.S. spending threatens the financial system. Combine it with the typical animal spirits, individuals being scared and hoarding money, and businesses growing cynical about the benefits of spending on capital. Also, according to the most recent Global Economic Prospects study from the World Bank, growth would fall to 2.4% in 2024 and then gradually rise to 2.7% in 2025. If staying out of another global recession is your only concern, then that may be cause for celebration. It could come as an icy pill to almost everybody else. According to predictions and forecasts, global growth will not reach the level required by the end of this decade to accomplish the Sustainable Development Goals. The first half of the 2020s appears to be the least impressive half-decade of growth the world economy has seen in at least 30 years. However, there's also potential for a pleasant surprise. The United States economy, which virtually single-handedly avoided a worldwide recession in the previous year, may surpass expectations again in 2024. According to expert predictions, the U.S. economy should grow by 1.6% in 2024 and 1.7% in 2025. However, U.S. GDP might be 0.7 points better in 2025 if the country's labor market stays unchanged as it has been since late 2020. Global growth would also be substantially greater as a result. That will be the cherry on top of all that happens without launching inflationary pressures again. Recessions are not impossible, even though many economists have forecast them, and they are not happening as expected. It's always a good idea for businesses to have backup plans for unexpected economic events, even if they manage to avoid that bullet. So, do you think a recession is around the corner? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, like, share, and subscribe to my channel for more. Check out my next video.